Hi, I'm Caitlin, and this is bread, as you can see in the picture. Bread is something that I'm sure you have never really thought about, but it's a really common substance that has a lot of properties that I think can help you in drawing almost anything. The three main properties are the porousness, the layers, and the translucency. In the baking process, bread has to grow, but it's not really going to lose its mass. So in order to accommodate that, it gets all these little air pockets, all the little pores and holes on the inside that make it really fluffy, you know? And the other thing is the layers. It has a crust, especially, the traditional loaf of bread. The heat kind of comes at it from the outside, and it has more heat, so it gets more compact, and it has the pores, and they kind of flatten out, so it gets harder, and that's what you get for your crust. The translucency is because there is water in bread. Not all the water gets baked out because of the crust, so it's kind of squishy on the inside, and you can kind of see through. It's just a little bit translucent and allows you to kind of gives it depth. Porousness is something that's seen throughout a lot of things in nature, most things. You could see it in rocks and sea sponges. This one's dead, but at one point it was alive. And you can see it in bones. We have a lot of pores in us, actually. You can see it in our skin and in our organs and all these gross in things. And we also use the concept to create man-made things like speakers. The other thing is layers. Uh, Layers are in everything, even if it's only at a microscopic level. You can see it in this adorable lizard. He has the layers, the way the scales are layered over his skin to perform a protective coating. You can see it in rocks, the way the rocks form over eons, millennia, and kind of shows us our history. That's nice if I were a geologist. And we use the concept like in books. And hair. That's a gross close-up of hair. Translucency. Translucency makes things look wet and alive because most things that are alive are kind of filled with water. Like leaves, they have to be able to absorb the sunlight, and this lemon is filled with delicious lemon juice. Glass is not alive, but it also has the properties of translucency, a little different. The person here is also translucent. You can kind of see in her ear and in her hair the way the light shines through. It kind of illuminates the pigment and illuminates the water and the blood inside her skin. Decay. Bread does fall apart. It's not going to last forever. I'm sorry. It's very wet, but it can only handle so much wetness. If you add more moisture to it, it kind of turns into a doughy mess, like before it was baked. When it gets too old, it gets dry sometimes too. It gets stale, and all the little fibers kind of lose their moisture and kind of freeze in place, and it turns into this solid hunk of bread. If you just let an entire loaf sit out, you can use it as a football. The other thing is mold, which is what happens when you have it in a warm, wet environment. And mold is an entirely different thing, and that mostly just sits on the surface. There's a lot of different types of mold. I'm not talking about that. Bread also has to break. It's the only way you can really eat it. I'd like to see someone eat a whole loaf of bread, but I'm probably not going to. It has, because of the pores, it always wants to break on those pores. If you just pull apart bread, you'll see it's trying to break along the weakest parts, so it'll break along a large series of holes if it can. Crumbs, crumbs are, just it's still a bunch of little fibers stuck together, some more than others. But you're probably not going to get a lot of that with a fresh loaf of bread because it's wet and things will stick and it's harder for things to come off. But as soon as it gets dry, it's going to start falling apart. Lastly, textures. There's a lot of textures of bread, and they all kind of have to do with the content of it. You get something spongy because that's got a lot more sugar in it. It's got milk and stuff, a lot of thicker things, so they kind of congeal and stick together and get really wet and chunky. You have the traditional loaf, which is what comes out, when you have your normal flour, water, yeast mixture, salt, whatever, if you don't want to taste bad. Flaky things are, it's a much thinner dough, and the way when it bakes, it comes out in thinner sheets, although it's still very porous. Flatbreads are kind of just the crust, and it allows a lot more bubbles to form in the surface because there's only a large air pocket on the inside, but there's still air trying to get out. Then there's hard things like cookies, which is even worse than spongy cake. And the moist thing is like the absolute worst. That's just wet and the most delicious thing, and you can see how shiny it is. That means it's the worst for you. Anyway, that's my presentation on bread.